Social media has a power to make people believe things that is completely unprecedented in the history of humanity. And this is why I think there's been perhaps an increase in, I've seen a big, again, I don't know if it's just because this is what YouTube has decided I'm interested in, which I'm really not, but it's been sending me an awful lot of flat earth debunking stuff, as if it thinks I believe in the flat earth and need debunked anyway. But it has an ability to make people believe things, or to encourage people in their existing beliefs, that is really unprecedented, and I think actually quite dangerous. And I think I'm not alone in thinking that, social media is rather like you having your own private TV station with your own private editorial staff.
Going back to this idea that people don't remember what the technology was like then, and the fact that they're not even aware of the simplest information about space, like it's a vacuum, that doesn't seem to deter holders of the conspiracy theory from commenting with things like, could never have got to the moon because it was just covered in flimsy foil.
God, yeah, the mylar foil thing.
Yeah, it's like, well, A, it keeps the weight down, B, it keeps it cool because it reflects the sunlight, and C, it's in a vacuum. It doesn't matter whether that foil was one atom thick. It's going to do the
acceleration,
job.
But yeah.
Another one said, well, how did they get those television signals back? It can't have happened because they didn't have the digital bandwidth there. The answer, it was analog.
Hello and welcome to another edition of How to Understand Today with me, Simon Wyndham.
I'm Dave Shapton.
I'm Phil Rhodes.
And today we're going to be discussing conspiracy theories, specifically the moon landings. Now, we had quite a bit of response to one of the shorts that we put out with a few people telling us we were flat out wrong, various conspiracy theorists coming out of the woodwork to comment. So the moon landings is perhaps one of the best known conspiracy theories out there. So we thought we'd spend a bit of time debunking some of the things that come up quite regularly. So Dave, let me get your initial thoughts on this conspiracy theory and where it might have come from and the reasons why people believe that the landings didn't happen.
Well, my initial reaction, and it's an emotional one, and it's quite visceral, is why are we trying to debunk this? Why is there a need to debunk theories about something which, for me, who was around at the time, so obviously happened? So, and just at a very high level, we were talking before we started, and Phil said, well, yeah, let's go over the main current objections to the idea that we landed on the moon. And just to be clear, there are a lot of people, I haven't got the figures, but it's probably, 10, 15%, almost everywhere, if not more, who now believe that the moon landings never happened. That's extraordinary, because at the time, it was just like everybody was glued to their TV screens. There were sort of 3-4 hour specials every night on TV. So it seems extraordinary that we should even need to be talking in terms of debunking the idea that these moon landings never happened and instead were an elaborate hoax. I always cringe slightly when I hear those two words together, elaborate and hoax, because, hoaxes, if they're going to be good, they need to be simple, foolproof. But I think the thing is that why would we have gone to the lengths of building a Saturn V rocket, which was the biggest rocket ever built at the time, which in itself was unbelievably complex and dangerous, put 3 astronauts at the top of it, a giant linear bomb, effectively. That's what it was. And it launched them into orbit, and you can't say we didn't do that because, loads of people were there. Nothing to do with NASA, and they watched. So we definitely did that bit of it. And I think if we didn't do that bit of it, which in some ways was the hardest bit, why would you want to hoax the landing on the moon thing? I'm not saying the landing on the moon wasn't difficult. Crikey. Let's just put this in perspective, which is that it's all of this stuff. It was literally a moonshot. We talk about moonshots today for things that we want to start developing, which are tricky and have a very small chance of succeeding. And there are only 2 variables, really, to make these moonshots work. One is a lot of money, and the other is a lot of people, a lot of the very best people on the planet. That's how the moonshot happened. And it's just like immensely risky. At the time, it seemed like almost impossible. But the point is, the fact that we did it shows that it wasn't impossible. It was just extraordinarily difficult.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that we were discussing before the show started recording was people's distorted view of how technology was and how technology in the past was and what we were capable of doing in the past. And this is often, quite often distorted. Another case in point is when it comes to climate change. So the mechanisms for climate change were understood as early as around 1820. The idea of man-made climate change was known about by around 1860 or so. So, we think of the knowledge of man-made climate change being a relatively recent thing, but we've known about it for a very, very long time indeed. We had the ability to be able to determine that that was happening a long time ago. And I think it's the same with the moon landings, because a lot of these conspiracy theorists don't believe that it was technically possible, that we had the technology to be able to do it. So Phil, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I suppose taking the broadest possible view, this, like most other conspiracy theories, comes down to, I don't mean to be unduly critical of people individually, but people's need to feel like they've figured something out that other people haven't. It's a need to feel like, oh, good grief, I've become awakened to the reality of the world and other people haven't. And I think that's a human tendency with a pretty solid, understandable basis. I mean, there's a reason for people to... Skepticism is reasonable. Skepticism is useful and essential in all kinds of circumstances. And that, I think, is why you get this and other conspiracy theories. I don't think it's really anything that much. The existence of conspiracy theories is not necessarily due to the believability or plausibility or otherwise of the event under discussion. It's not really about whether the moon landings were possible. It's about people's need to feel special. And that sounds like a terribly damning indictment of people. But as I say, skepticism is key. We've evolved skepticism for a reason. As to whether or not humanity went to the moon, they certainly spent an absolutely enormous amount of effort pretending otherwise. I mean, perhaps the way to look at it is to look at it from the perspective of that it was a space race at the time. And if they weren't actually going to do it, how did they decide which of the two principal powers were going to win? Because if they're not actually going to do it, they could have said they've done it at any time. And it wouldn't have taken that long, that much lead time.
And it's not like the Russians wouldn't have been monitoring it in extraordinary detail.
And there's all kinds of plausibility. I mean, again, I think last time we spoke, we talked about other things which fail on a scale of the conspiracy thing. I mean, like flat Earth and other stuff, the number of people who would have to be in on this scam to make it sustainable, to make it possible to keep this thing going.
400,000 on the American side.
Yeah, it would be so... I mean, okay, fine, you can say that many of those people... Look, okay, so here I go with my accustomed devil's advocacy. You could say, okay, fine, all of those people were doing what they were doing and they were all being misled and they all thought they were doing it honestly and legitimately and they weren't. And I suppose if you want to go down that road as far as you can, you could argue, I suppose, that yes, it was all faked. It's a plausibility shortfall. Can you really do that to that number of people for that long? No, you can't.
Yeah, you're right. It's a thought experiment. Yeah, let's imagine that some of those 400,000 people would have to have been hoaxed as well, because you can't keep 400. So some would have thought they were doing it, but they actually weren't.
Yes.
So what about the people who built the telemetry in the spacecraft?
It's a lot of it.
Yeah, and the heart rate monitors and all the physiological monitoring. If they weren't in on the secret, they would have immediately said, look, this telemetry is not working because it says we're still on the ground.
I think one of the thing for me with the moon landing hoax thing is that it is one of the best known conspiracy theories around. But all of the reasoning behind it, the so-called evidence, is so flimsy that, it can be debunked in seconds.
Yeah, or misconstrued.
Based
on a misunderstanding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, stuff such as the markings on the photographs appearing behind objects when it's just simply faint markings that have been, the picture's been reproduced. It's not the original photo. In the original photo, you can see all of those markers. There was the case of the rock that supposedly had a letter C or something on it. People were claiming, therefore, it was a Hollywood prop, as if, they're going to leave this great big mark on a rock. And it was just from something like a hair or some other object getting in when they were reproducing that photograph. So it's all so flimsy. It's just absurd stuff like any traction at all.
Stuff like there were no stars visible. Or if you know anything about photography, or possibly even nothing about photography, you'll know that if the sun is shining bright in your eyes, you're not going to see stars. It's just try seeing stars in daylight. The only reason we don't have a black sky is because of the atmosphere.
Yes, and the best one, of course, is the flag flapping in the wind when it wasn't moving. It was literally had a pole to hold it up because they knew it would just flop down. So they put a pole on the top of it. And then it just looked crumpled because it had been stashed in a box for several weeks. It's all such simple thoughts.
Did it not? It flapped around when they launched the ascent stage, and the engine flaps was pushing it around. But yeah, I think that was
and the other one was, and we discussed this the other week, didn't we, Dave? Was when the orbiter took off, went back to the ship to take them back. How on earth could they ever get the camera to time it perfectly to follow it as it went up?
It's not a very good follow, actually.
It was an amazing, but it took them several missions. Well, was it 3 missions, I think, to be able to finally nail the timing? So they didn't do it first time. It took quite a number of goes before they managed it.
Yeah, I mean,
because of that, so it's when you actually see that shot, it was like remarkable when you realise all of the things that had to fall into place. And talking of all things that have to fall into place, let's look at points of failure. When we're talking about mission safety and viability, we tend to talk in terms of points of failure. How many things are there that could go wrong that will completely jeopardise or destroy the mission? And in space flight, and in a complex space flight like a moon landing, there tend to be thousands.
Yeah.
So any one of those, indeed on Apollo 13, there was a point of failure which I don't think anybody had ever considered, which was the oxygen tank exploding. As we've just said, these things are flying bombs. And it's stopping them exploding is probably a very major part of the mission, as much as, actually landing on the moon. Sorry, Phil, you were going to say something.
I mean, I can't remember what I was going to say now. Yeah, I mean, there is something to be said about, I mean, I got this particularly with regard to the whole flat earth conspiracy, which is, very much in the same sort of lines, is that in extremis, you could say that, and a lot of this argument happens over YouTube and happens over social media. You say, well, look, there is literally nothing that you can put on YouTube that you couldn't claim has been mocked up in a studio these days. I mean, visual effects techniques are more than capable of producing everything you've ever seen. Now, they recently did a trip to Antarctica where they actually had people live streaming back. So it was difficult to say that it was being post-produced because people were talking live. Again, do you personally know anyone who was talking live? Well, maybe you don't. Maybe it all was. So in extremis, you can say that all this stuff could be faked. Could it all be faked? Yes. But just the sheer scale of what you're proposing to have been done is implausible. And as I say, at some point, in terms of a faked space race, at some point, the Russians would have had to have agreed to fake losing. So why wouldn't you just go, well, we went to the moon yesterday. That was really easy. No problem whatsoever. I mean, we can do this anytime we like. So there's some sort of logic problems that you have to look at with this stuff, which don't really survive the light of day.
And also, I mean, if we're looking at the actual staging of a hoax, I mean, there were, I've forgotten the number, there were 7 landings.
Something like that, yeah.
It was 11 to 17. And 13 didn't land. And each of which had, especially the earlier flights, had hundreds of hours of TV coverage. Now, this was not just a hoax. Oh, let's spend 5 minutes pretending we're on the moon. This was across multiple missions, pretending that we were on the moon when we were actually in a shed simulating low gravity. Having to make sure nobody left a packet of fags on the ground. All the things that could go wrong and didn't. So then we come back to the attempts to disprove the actual landing. And I think that there's a new wave of questions about this now from people who weren't alive at the time, don't remember. I mean, I was incredibly young at the time. I do remember what technology was like at the time, because even from the age of about 5, I've been a technology geek. So I remember how it progressed very well. And yes, in comparison with even a 10-year-old iPhone, the computing resources were tiny. But actually, I'm not saying aerodynamics is simple. It's complicated maths, but it's quite simple to write programs, or quite feasible. It's quite realistic to write programs on the kind of computers they had in those days, even though they were on punch cards. Or
just barely more than that, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I haven't got the specs, but the computer on board the lunar module, you almost, you almost wouldn't recognize it as a computer. It would have been unbelievably difficult to program, except that there were experts who knew how to do that. And there were plenty of mathematicians, astronomers, experts in space dynamics who would have produced these programs. These programs work very well. So the idea that we didn't have the technology to do it back then is simply not true. Yes, it was primitive compared to what we had now, but then, a paperback book was primitive compared to the computers they had in 1969.
No, it wasn't the computer on the space shuttle. I think that wasn't even the power of a ZX81, was it? It was quite still pretty.
No, they never updated it throughout the life of.
I think you'd have to challenge it. But the thing with computing and that stuff is that people have Apollo guidance computers now. There is one in private ownership with the original software on it, and people, all of the software for this is actually available. It's all on fanfold printouts, which would have been the zenith of technology at the time. But it does appear, if you look at the code, it really does appear to be a set of software to allow something to launch, orbit, and make a lunar insertion. I mean, it does appear to be code that's designed to do that. It doesn't appear to be code, and if you run it, it works. So it does appear to be code that's designed to do that, and not code that's designed to make it look like you're doing that whilst not doing that.
Not designed to flash the lights and make it look all computery.
Yeah, I mean, right down to the point where you can look at some of the problems they had. For instance, on one of the flights, and this was when they did Apollo 11 was doing its first approach, and they had some problems with the computer system. One of the reasons they had that problem was that they punched up a button, punched up a program that would give you a readout of a certain value. And Buzz Aldrin had punched up one that would repeatedly show you that value. It would update it every half a second or so, I think it was. And there was one that would give you this number immediately, and another one that would repeatedly do it, so it would update and it would change as you were flying down. And if he'd used the one that showed you the number immediately and didn't update it, everything would have been fine. It would have reduced the load on the computer. So that's a pretty enthusiastic bit of problem simulation for something that didn't happen.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And going back to this idea that people don't remember what the technology was like then, and the fact that they're not even aware of the simplest information about space, like it's a vacuum, that doesn't seem to deter holders of the conspiracy theory from commenting with things like, could never have got to the moon because it was just covered in flimsy foil.
God, yeah, the mylar foil thing.
Yeah, it's like, well, A, it keeps the weight down, B, it keeps it cool because it reflects the sunlight, and C, it's in a vacuum. It doesn't matter whether that foil was one atom thick.
Yeah.
It's going to do
acceleration,
the job.
But yeah.
Another one said, well, how did they get those television signals back? It can't have happened because they didn't have the digital bandwidth there. The answer? It was analog.
Yes. Watch the movie The Dish with Sam Neill. The movie The Dish does fictionalize this a little bit in a way that's actually something of a shame. And what they did was they used space telescopes to get the signals back from the moon.
to the point where it's actually quite interesting because the people, this is an example of the people who would have had to have been in on the conspiracy, because the people who were directing these space telescopes would have had to have known not to point their dishes in the right direction, or they would have had to have known to point them in what would have been the right direction, but somehow fake up the fact that they're receiving a signal. And if you're part of the regular staff of a major space telescope, as were the ones depicted in the Sam Neill movie, you would have been known very well what the setup was. And, these people were not NASA employees. They were a bunch of Australian astrophysicists who'd been very happy to have some time on their dish hired by NASA to do not only the TV downlink, but also other downlinks as well, the telemetry and so forth. And there is, in fact, a mistake in that film because, that's a bit of a spoiler, but to skirt around the issue, they point the dish at where they think the Apollo spacecraft ought to be, and they find it. But of course, they wouldn't find it because it should be approaching the moon rather than, it's not just going straight from Earth to moon. There's not like a straight line between the two. So by pointing the dish at the moon, they wouldn't have found the spacecraft, but it would have been over here somewhere or over there somewhere. So that's actually a mistake in the movie that wouldn't have worked in reality. But to say that all those people were in on some sort of conspiracy is just not plausible.
Well, I mean, I just got to correct myself from earlier. I did, for some reason, refer to the lander as the orbiter. I don't know why I did that, but
yes,
they have surveyed the moon in high resolution, and
yes,
you can see the footprints left by the astronauts. You can see the flag still up there.
You can.
But of course, another one of the so-called pieces of evidence that the conspiracists put forward is that, why can't we use a telescope to spot these things on the surface of the moon?
Mm.
But obviously we have sent space vehicles up there and surveyed the surface, and we can very much see the evidence for the moon landing.
And we've left mirrors on the moon. You can fire a laser at a mirror on the moon, measure the time it takes to reflect back, and that'll give you the position of the moon within a few centimetres.
Yeah.
Anyone can do that.
Yeah, and that's how did we put them there?
Through them.
Again, to play devil's advocate, you could say that we put them there using an unmanned spacecraft. We could. There's almost nothing that you could
with the primitive technology making it possible for a robot to autonomously place them on the surface.
The thing is that, all the computing resources, the computing resources and the Apollo guidance computer is plausibly a modern computer. It's recognizable. If you're into computer architecture, it is a modern computer in terms of how it runs. Yeah.
Geekiness.
Yeah.
Inserting yourself parenthetically. It was the first time that I'd ever seen so-called 7-segment display, which is where you have, you can make any number out of these 7 LEDs arranged in a figure of 8.
Not LEDs.
So what were they?
It's called the DSKY, D-S-K-Y. An Apollo guidance computer DSKY is an electroluminescent display. If you look on YouTube, there is a very wonderful YouTube channel called Applied Science, where he builds one. And he figures out, these days you can get the electroluminescent stuff that you can airbrush onto things and make your car glow or whatever. And he actually builds a recreation of the Apollo guidance computer display. And if you watch the Apollo 13 movie, it's definitely been done with LEDs and it looks wrong because it's too bright and it's hot spotty.
Okay.
Sorry, carry on.
Yes. So the first time I saw that, I recognised all the numbers apart from 4.
Yes.
Which was like a sort of backwards or something. But once you get your head around that, you look at 4s on 7-segment displays, which still exist, like on my oven cooker, and you get used to it. But I don't know if that was a breakthrough they made for space flight or whether it was the first time it was seen.
I don't think so. No. It's probably come before then, but certainly, it was not an outrageous advance on what had been made before. I think Raytheon made them. I think it was Raytheon. Yeah.
Well, it's probably digging deeper than we need to. But I do think that the fact that the people weren't around then probably seems like, 1969 probably seems so far away in time. And indeed it was. Somebody sent me a note the other day saying that the police, tracked by the police, called So Lonely, was actually released closer to the end of World War II than to today. So it's 46 years old. And it's just extraordinary how we perceive time. But if you weren't around, the way you perceive time as opposed to the time when you were around is going to be very different. I think you tend to get a very compressed view of developments and technological change. And also, we are normalized to very, very high component counts, transistor counts, for example. We talk in terms of billions. Whereas, you know, early computers, like talking individual bytes. And if you were lucky, you'd have 128 of them. You know, so the sort of space between now and then is absolutely vast. So anyone that neither knows much about space nor was around at the time should think very, very carefully before posting about the veracity of these moon landings. It's almost hard to explain how much public attention there was on these landings.
So if you were working on it, I mean, then, you know, your family would know, your friends would know, you know.
Yeah, well, my dad was one of the 400,000. He was a chief materials engineer at an aerospace company.
Oh, there you go.
And he used to go to the States, I think, just to give advice about certain materials. But yeah, that's why there were 400,000 people, because almost everything was new.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I can't remember the name of the documentary, but it was released 2 or 3 years ago about the Apollo missions with 35mm film restored in like a 4K transfer, and it looks absolutely stunning. It's just some of the most fantastic restored film footage I've seen in a very long time. But you know, when you watch the Saturn rocket taking off, there's no faking that. You would need today's level of
VFX
to be able to do that convincingly. And as we all know, CG artists do tend to take liberties with physics and the effects of how these things.
I mean, they said he flew a rocket. I mean, I think that, you know, even with the most devil's advocacy in the world, you've got to accept that they flew the rocket of some sort.
That's the point, and that's really hard. And why would they have done that if they were just going to hoax it? It doesn't make any sense. And I think what you're saying, Phil, about why people go down the conspiracy path, I think it's true. There's often an element of truth which kind of acts as the kindling to start the fire. I don't think that's the case with the moon landing conspiracy, because there is no truth. It was in no sense a hoax. So I think it's more a case of general paranoia about, you know, they being the US government and the Cold War. There's no shortage of paranoia. And indeed, there were conspiracies. You know, there's a difference between a wild conspiracy theory and conspiracies. There are conspiracies all over the place, but generally, you know, they're not. We're not misinformed about them. Generally, when they come out, we say, "Oh yeah, that was a funny old time, wasn't it?" You know, trying to assassinate some Southern American leader with an exploding cigar, and that kind of thing. And of course, you had round about that time, or slightly before it, you had McCarthyism, which was
going there. Yeah.
Persecution of anybody who was remotely left of centre politically. So yeah, you can understand there being genuine conspiracies and also conspiracy theories which turned out to be unfounded because of the general, you know, atmosphere, fevered atmosphere around politics and rapidly improving science and being in the middle of a Cold War. So yeah, you can totally understand that. The difference is that it's with those conspiracies, they either are conspiracies, and discovering historical papers, you know, 30 years later reveals it, and everyone goes, "Oh, I can't believe they did that." But a conspiracy theory is where it's so unlikely, because there is in science and in philosophy, there is a sort of well-founded principle that if you're looking for an explanation of something, go for the most likely one. Why would you do anything other than go for the one that is most likely based on the evidence that you see?
I mean, most conspiracy theories do tend to run on confirmation bias. There's no testing of the theory in any kind of rigorous way.
Yeah.
And in fact, social media, which fans the fire, is basically industrialized confirmation bias.
Yeah. I mean, there are cases where there are some very absurd sounding conspiracy theories that do turn out to be true. The Hunter Biden laptop thing is a case in point. The idea that his laptop somehow randomly ended up in the repair shop of the blind computer repair guy, and he had access to all the stuff that was on it. The whole thing surrounding that sounded absurd on its face, but it actually did turn out to be genuine.
It's actually not very interesting or consequential, ultimately.
No, that is very true. That is very true.
Excuse me, sneezing. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that this overall, this whole thing tells us much more about people than it does about the moon landings or climate change or flat Earth or any of this stuff.
So, yes, people. I recently had some builders working in my house, and I had a long chat with one of them. An interesting guy, informed. And he said, one thing I don't believe, he said, I don't believe we ever went to the moon. And I said, what on earth makes you think that? Well, it just seems impossible, doesn't it?
A lot of things seem impossible. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if it genuinely was impossible, that means we didn't do it. But it wasn't impossible because we did do it.
I mean, the answer as ever is, well, if it wasn't done, and the whole point of doing it was really to win some sort of political East versus West battle, then why didn't the Russians pretend to do it before the Americans pretended to do it? I mean, I suppose you could say that the Russians were genuinely trying to do it because they thought it was plausible, but the Americans weren't because they'd established that it wasn't. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, there will be no convincing some people who, believe in this stuff. I remember there was a documentary produced about the conspiracy about 9/11, and they took these people who didn't believe that there was an actual plane that crashed in, was it Pennsylvania, because there was no evidence of the plane's fuselage having been there because it pretty much just buried itself in the ground and disintegrated. But they had an air accident investigator. They went to the location and he explained to them how the physics of that crash worked. But there was at least a couple of them that no matter how much evidence was presented to them, they would not be convinced that they were wrong in any shape or form. And as you said earlier, Phil, it's because these people want to believe that they know something that other people don't. There's a lot of that about.
And also once people have got their brains around this stuff, this gets violently political, so I'll be careful what I say, but it becomes something that they want to believe, and it becomes part of someone's self-respect and self-worth, that I'm someone who sees things for what they are. Now, one of the most valuable things I've ever seen in a narrative fictional feature film is in Pi, the black and white, grungy, early Aronofsky. And several times in that movie, the lead character, who is going slightly crazy, says, review my assumptions. And people don't do that. We don't get any philosophical training in schools at all. And we're never told to say, right, hang on a minute, stop. Am I convincing myself of crazy things here? And that doesn't mean don't think of skeptical responses to things. It means do that. But you have to apply that skepticism equally to your whole thought process. And if you fail to do that, then you're in a very difficult position.
Yeah. Sorry, Simon, go on.
I was just going to say that a lot of these people that I've encountered, I know one in particular, once they've fallen down one rabbit hole, they fall down all of them.
Yeah, others.
This person doesn't believe in the moon landings. They have all this theory about the chemtrails and all that.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of explanation for that, which is that it's that we need, and this ties in with what Phil was saying about what we should be taught in schools, we need to develop or know how to develop a cognitive immune system. So if something comes up that seems a bit dodgy, we are suitably cynical about it. However, on the surface, it might seem attractive or fascinating, or, God, I wish that was true, because that would be amazing.
I wish it was true.
Yeah. So it is this cognitive immune system. And I think it's a very good analogy, because without that, it becomes a cascade. It's like if your bodily immune system, your physical immune system is degraded, you just get one illness after another, probably several at the same time. And I think it is the same with these conspiracy theories. So once you're susceptible, these conspiracy theories are very opportunistic. The way they are designed, the way they're explained, it's very, very easy. If you are, for any reason, susceptible, or, to use a pejorative word, gullible, then these will come and, absolutely swamp your critical thinking.
I mean, there's a bit of it that if people enjoy doing this stuff and enjoy having conversations with other people who have, seen the light, as it were, and become awakened to the possibilities, they will get pleasure from that and seek more pleasure, which is not unreasonable. I think the really fundamental thing about it is that what you were saying, Dave, about this being like a cognitive immune system. Well, yes, but then being skeptical about things and developing your own theories and engaging perhaps in some, knowing devil's advocacy about things is part of your cognitive immune system. So looking at something you've been presented with and saying, oh, hang on a minute, we're entirely sure this is right, is completely reasonable and is a sort of cognitive immune system. So, but there's a happy medium between being healthily skeptical of things and allowing yourself to be dragged down the garden path. And I think that's the difference that we're trying to define,
In a formalized context, that's called science.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Although, the kind of people who are susceptible to this kind of thing, it's almost a bit like being hypnotized. If you're hypnotized, the hypnotist doesn't hypnotize you. You effectively hypnotize yourself. The hypnotist is training you to be able to put yourself into some, a trance-like state. You've got to want it. You've got to want to be in that state. And I think it's the same for these conspiracy theories, because they want that. They want to believe. They want to be able to have something better in their lives, because they might be living a very dull, boring life. They just want some excitement. So they want to buy into the whole thing. There's no skepticism there, because, as I say, they want it.
I think that makes complete sense. And I think that it's one of several things that I think that, we don't teach kids anything about finance. We don't teach kids anything about politics. We don't really teach critical thinking. And I think we should.
No, I think some of the younger generation are slightly better, at deciphering things online between stuff that is fake and silly and stuff that isn't. Certainly, the older generation isn't so good at that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would bring up the whole social media thing, and I think that social media has. I've disagreed with people quite a lot recently on this. Social media has a power to make people believe things that is completely unprecedented in the history of humanity. And this is why I think there's been perhaps an increase in, I've seen a big, again, I don't know if it's just because this is what YouTube has decided I'm interested in, which I'm really not, but it's been sending me an awful lot of flat earth debunking stuff, as if it thinks I believe in the flat earth and need debunk anyway. But it has an ability to make people believe things, or to encourage people in their existing beliefs, that is really unprecedented, and I think actually quite dangerous. And I think I'm not alone in thinking that, social media is rather like you having your own private TV station with your own private editorial staff designed to produce TV that's of interest solely to you. And on that basis is, people go, oh, it's the same as just having TV. It's the same as having a newspaper. No, it's like having a newspaper that's solely edited for you. It's like having a TV show with a news channel that's solely edited for you.
And as a layer on top of that, you've now got proprietors who, with their own agenda,
who absolutely do have a political agenda,
to personalise everything that goes out on the platform to favour their views.
Really, I think that the idea of having people be able to talk to each other is lovely and wonderful. Being able to share ideas on specific topics, no matter what obscure thing you're into, somebody on the internet will be talking about it, which is great. That needs to be preserved. What needs to be stomped on, I think there's going to have to be regulation of this, and call that an extremist point of view. I think people are overlooking just how powerful this stuff is, and just how powerful it is, and how able it is to make people believe things, even when those things are complete nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, and then it's come, and then that sort of, the way that it serves up those stories, or content tailored to each individual person, if that's all they're seeing, it's kind of like if you have something, if say you tell a lie, you could tell that lie to yourself over and over and over again, and if you do that, you will convince yourself that it was true eventually.
Yeah, it's called truth by repeated assertion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, it's very similar, I think, with this, because it's confirmation bias. You're getting served up all the stuff that you want to believe in. Oh, yes, that person's saying this, that person's saying that. There must be something in this, but if all these people are saying that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could go on forever talking about this subject, and I'm sure we will return to it. But I just love it if people in the comments who disagree with us could give us exactly what their reasons are. Happy to engage with anyone on this.
Got to have the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we've gone into that into quite some depth. So I think we'll leave it there for the time being. So as Dave said, if you could comment on what you thought of today's episode, and please like and subscribe if you agree with us. Maybe you don't agree with us, but still like and subscribe.
Dislike and subscribe. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think we'll leave it there for today. So thank you, Dave and Phil.
See you next time.
Have a good one.
See you guys.